Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell had been briefed on Zephyrian hostility, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer concentrated disdain radiating from the being standing across the conference table. Kyra Veltar stood nearly 7 feet tall, her crystalline skin catching the afternoon light streaming through the colony hall's windows, throwing prismatic patterns across the walls that might have been beautiful if not for the cold fury in her silver eyes. "So," Kyra said, her voice carrying the musical quality common to her species but twisted with unmistakable contempt, "the humans send us a child to negotiate the future of two civilizations." Sarah kept her expression neutral despite the insult. At 32, she was hardly a child, but she understood that Zephyrians lived considerably longer than humans. "I'm here to facilitate the integration process, not to negotiate." The terms were already agreed upon by both governments. Integration. Kyra spoke the word like it tasted bitter. Such a pleasant euphemism for colonial absorption. "Tell me, Commander Mitchell, what exactly do humans believe they can contribute to a world that has thrived for millennia without your assistance?" "Technology transfer, agricultural techniques, medical advances. We have technology far superior to your crude mechanical devices. Our agricultural systems are in perfect harmony with Kepler 452b's ecosystem. And our medical understanding surpasses yours by centuries." Kyra moved closer to the table, her crystalline features reflecting the light in patterns that emphasized her alien beauty and obvious disdain. "What you offer is not contribution, it is contamination." Sarah felt her diplomatic training being tested to its limits. The integration agreement was reached because both species have complementary strengths. Human adaptability and innovation combined with Zephyrian knowledge and environmental mastery. "Human adaptability," Kyra interrupted with a laugh that sounded like wind chimes in a storm. "Is that what you call your species' tendency to arrive uninvited and reshape everything to suit your limitations?" "We were invited. Your government specifically requested human assistance with." "My government consists of old fools who have forgotten what it means to be Zephyrian." Kyra's skin patterns shifted to deeper, more aggressive hues. "They see your soft pink flesh and assume you pose no threat. They cannot conceive that weakness itself can be a form of conquest." Sarah stood up, her patience finally reaching its limit. "Ms. Veltar, if you have fundamental objections to the integration process, perhaps you should discuss them with your superiors rather than taking them out on the human representative. Perhaps the human representative should demonstrate why her species deserves to share a world with beings who could crush her with a single gesture." Kyra's silver eyes glittered with challenge. "Your people pride themselves on problem-solving under pressure. Very well, solve this." The building shook suddenly, a deep rumble that seemed to come from the planet's core itself. Seismic activity was common on Kepler 452b, but this felt different, stronger, more sustained. The lights flickered as the tremor intensified, and Sarah found herself reaching for the table to maintain her balance. Before she could react further, Kyra's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, pulling her away from the conference table just as a section of ceiling crashed down onto the spot where Sarah had been standing. For a moment, they stood frozen, Sarah staring at the debris that would have crushed her, Kyra staring at her own hand wrapped around Sarah's wrist. The Zephyrian's grip was firm but careful, her crystalline skin warm against Sarah's human flesh. Kyra began, then seemed to realize what she was doing. She released Sarah's wrist as if it had burned her, stepping back with an expression of confusion and anger. "I merely prevented you from injuring yourself. Dead humans create diplomatic complications." Sarah rubbed her wrist, still feeling the warmth of Kyra's touch. "Thank you. Do not misinterpret basic survival instinct as concern for your welfare," Kyra snapped, but her voice lacked its previous venom. "I simply have no desire to explain to my superiors why the human representative was crushed by falling debris during our first meeting." The building shook again, and emergency lighting activated as the main power systems fluctuated. Through the cracked windows, Sarah could see other buildings showing similar damage, and emergency signals were already beginning to sound throughout the colony. "We need to coordinate emergency response," Sarah said, activating her communicator. This could be the beginning of a major seismic event. Humans and their technology, Kyra muttered, though she was already moving toward the damaged doorway. Always assuming machines can solve what observation and instinct could predict. Your instincts predicted this earthquake. Any Zephyrian could feel the planet's distress building for days. Your people construct their settlements without consulting the world they're building upon. Kyra paused at the doorway, looking back at Sarah with an expression that mixed annoyance with something that might have been concern. Can you walk, or will human fragility require assistance? Sarah took a step forward, testing her balance. The building continued to shake intermittently, but she seemed uninjured. I can manage. Good. Because I have no intention of carrying you through a disaster zone. Kyra's words were harsh, but Sarah noticed that the Zephyrian waited for her to reach the doorway before proceeding, and she positioned herself on Sarah's left side. Between her and the most damaged section of wall. As they emerged into the chaos of emergency response, Sarah found herself wondering whether Kyra's hostility was as straightforward as it appeared. The hand that had pulled her to safety had been gentle despite its strength, and the silver eyes that glared at her with such apparent contempt kept flicking back to check her condition. Perhaps, Sarah thought as sirens wailed around them and the ground continued to tremble beneath their feet, this integration process was going to be more complicated than either of their governments had anticipated. Stay close, Kyra commanded as they approached the Emergency Coordination Center. I refuse to explain to anyone how I managed to lose the human representative during a minor planetary disturbance. Minor? Sarah looked around at the cracked buildings and scattered debris. This is nothing compared to what Kepler 452b can produce when truly disturbed. Kyra's crystalline features reflected the emergency lights in patterns that emphasized her alien nature. Though I suppose to soft human senses, it might seem challenging. Sarah smiled despite the circumstances. Well then, I guess it's fortunate that soft humans are apparently worth saving, even from minor planetary disturbances. Kyra's step faltered almost imperceptibly. Do not read meaning into reflexive actions, Commander Mitchell. Even I would preserve valuable equipment during an emergency. But as they moved through the chaotic aftermath together, Sarah noticed that Kyra's protective positioning never wavered, and her silver eyes continued their careful monitoring of Sarah's condition. Whatever the Zephyrian diplomat claimed to feel about humans, her actions suggested a very different truth. The question was whether Kyra herself was aware of the contradiction. The Emergency Coordination Center was chaos when Sarah and Kyra arrived. Human colonists and Zephyrian natives worked side by side, but their coordination was haphazard at best. Different communication protocols, incompatible equipment, and fundamental disagreements about priorities created more confusion than efficiency. This is precisely what I expected, Kyra observed with satisfaction as they watched a human engineer argue with a Zephyrian geological specialist about seismic monitoring techniques. Your people's insistence on technological solutions clashing with actual understanding of planetary systems. Sarah studied the situation, noting how the two groups naturally segregated despite the emergency. And your people's insistence on traditional methods ignoring potentially useful innovations. Neither approach is working. Because one approach is wrong, Kyra replied curtly. Zephyrians have lived in harmony with this world for millennia, yes, you mentioned that. Sarah interrupted, moving toward the central coordination table. But you've never dealt with a colony population this size before, or with the kind of infrastructure that humans build. Traditional methods might not scale to current needs. Kyra followed, her crystalline skin shifting to deeper, more aggressive hues. So you admit that human presence has made the situation worse. I admit that the situation is more complex than either of our species anticipated. Sarah began reviewing damage reports and resource allocation charts. Which means we need to combine approaches rather than arguing about which one is superior. There is no combination possible between wisdom and ignorance. Despite her words, Kyra moved to stand beside Sarah at the coordination table, her height advantage allowing her to easily review the same documents. Sarah noticed that the Zephyrian's positioning put her between Sarah and the most agitated group of responders. A protective stance that contradicted her hostile words. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a pattern in the damage reports. "The seismic activity isn't random. There's a progression from the northern mining sectors toward the southern agricultural zones." Kyra leaned closer to examine the data, and Sarah caught a faint scent that reminded her of ozone and crystal formations. "The mining operations," Kyra said after a moment, her voice thoughtful rather than combative for the first time since they'd met. "Human excavation techniques have destabilized the crystalline matrix that maintains geological stability in that region. Can the matrix be repaired? Perhaps. But it would require." Kyra paused, her expression conflicted. "It would require combining Zephyrian resonance techniques with human precision equipment." Sarah looked up at her. "The kind of combination you just said was impossible." "I said no such thing," Kyra snapped, her hostile demeanor returning immediately. "I merely stated that in this specific instance, our clearly superior methods might be enhanced by your crude but, occasionally useful, tools." "Of course. Silly of me to think you were admitting that cooperation might be beneficial. Do not put words in my mouth, human. Wouldn't dream of it." Sarah turned back to the coordination table, but she was smiling. "So what do we need to stabilize this crystalline matrix?" For the next 3 hours, they worked together with increasing efficiency. Kyra's understanding of Zephyrian geological systems combined with Sarah's logistical expertise created solutions that neither could have developed alone. But with each successful collaboration, Kyra's verbal hostility seemed to intensify, as if their compatibility was a personal affront. "Your equipment placement is completely wrong," Kyra declared after they'd successfully coordinated the first stabilization team. "Any competent engineer would have positioned the resonance amplifiers along the primary crystalline pathways." "Which is exactly where we positioned them," Sarah pointed out. "Based on your recommendations. I merely corrected your initial errors. Do not assume that following basic instruction constitutes genuine competence." Sarah noticed that several other responders were starting to watch their interactions with amusement. The Zephyrians' insults were becoming so disconnected from their actual performance that even her own people seemed to recognize the contradiction. "Kyra," called Zeth Morvain, an elderly Zephyrian engineer, "perhaps you could explain why you continue to berate the human while implementing her tactical suggestions." Kyra's crystalline skin flushed with deeper colors. "I implement nothing. I merely redirect." Her misguided attempts toward more productive applications. By following her plans exactly as presented? By salvaging what little value can be extracted from fundamentally flawed human thinking, Kyra replied stiffly. Sarah watched this exchange with growing understanding. "Kyra, are you getting in trouble with your people for working with me?" "I am not working with you. I am managing your inevitable failures to minimize damage to important operations." "That's not what I asked." Kyra turned away, her attention focused intensely on coordination displays that didn't require her direct supervision. Zephyrian diplomatic protocols do not concern humans. But Sarah caught the way Kyra's shoulders tensed, and the careful neutrality that crept into her expression when other Zephyrians were watching. The hostility, she realized, might be as much performance as genuine feeling. Their breakthrough came during the 4th hour, when a major aftershock threatened to collapse the primary communications array. Sarah and Kyra coordinated the emergency response with seamless efficiency, Sarah managing human technical teams while Kyra directed Zephyrian resonance specialists, their commands complementing each other perfectly. "The communication relay is stabilized," reported the lead technician. "Whatever you two did worked perfectly." Kyra immediately stiffened. "We did nothing together. I simply prevented human incompetence from causing additional failures." "Right," the technician said with obvious skepticism. "By coordinating perfectly with said incompetence. By maintaining sufficient oversight to." "Kyra," Sarah interrupted quietly, "it's okay to admit we work well together." The Zephyrian's silver eyes met hers for a moment, and Sarah saw something vulnerable flicker beneath the surface hostility. Then Kyra's expression hardened again. "Working well together implies equality of contribution," she said coldly. "I merely prevented your fumbling from creating disasters that would have required Zephyrian expertise to resolve." "Of course you did." As the immediate crisis stabilized and teams began implementing longer-term repairs, Sarah found herself studying Kyra's behavior patterns. The Zephyrian's insults came most frequently after successful collaborations, her protective positioning intensified when other people were around, and her hostility seemed to require conscious effort to maintain. "Kyra," she said as they reviewed final coordination reports, "can I ask you something?" "You may ask." "I may choose not to answer." "Why did you really grab my hand during that first earthquake?" Kyra's crystalline features went completely still. "I explained that. Basic survival instinct." "Survival instinct to save someone you consider weak and useless?" "Survival instinct to prevent diplomatic complications." "Even though letting me get crushed would have solved your integration problem permanently." Kyra was quiet for a long moment, her luminescent patterns shifting in ways that Sarah was beginning to recognize as signs of internal conflict. When she finally spoke, her voice carried less venom than usual. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "even useless humans serve some minimal purpose in emergency situations. Additional hands, however incompetent, can be marginally helpful during crisis response." Sarah smiled. "So you're saying I'm marginally helpful?" "I am saying that in specific circumstances, human presence can be tolerated, without complete disaster." "High praise coming from you. Do not mistake practical acknowledgement for approval, Commander Mitchell." But Kyra's tone lacked its usual bite, and Sarah noticed that the Zephyrian hadn't moved away from her position beside the coordination table. As night fell over the colony and emergency operations shifted to round-the-clock monitoring, Sarah found herself wondering what Kyra Veltar was really fighting, the human presence on her world, or her own growing recognition that the enemy she'd expected to find might not be an enemy at all. The second seismic event hit at dawn, 3 days after the first. Sarah was reviewing overnight reports when the emergency klaxons began wailing, followed immediately by Kyra's voice over the communication system. "All response teams to emergency stations. Major seismic activity detected along the primary fault network. This is not a drill." Sarah rushed to the coordination center to find organized chaos, teams mobilizing with the efficiency born of recent practice, but the scale of this event dwarfed their previous crisis. The displays showed seismic readings that made the first earthquake look like a minor tremor. "Status report," she called as she reached the central command station. "Magnitude 8.2 with multiple epicenters," reported Chief Engineer Kane. "The entire northern sector is compromised, and we're reading structural failures throughout the colony." Kyra appeared beside Sarah so suddenly it was startling. "The crystalline matrix destabilization has reached cascade failure. If we cannot halt the progression within 6 hours, the geological damage will be irreversible. Can we evacuate the threatened areas?" "Evacuation of human facilities, yes. But the cascade will destroy Zephyrian population centers that have existed for millennia." Kyra's crystalline skin had shifted to deep blue patterns that Sarah was learning indicated extreme stress. "My people's sacred sites, cultural centers, generational memory crystals, all will be lost." Sarah studied the seismic progression charts, noting how the damage pattern followed the fault lines with terrifying precision. "What about your resonance stabilization techniques?" "Insufficient. The scale requires coordinated response across multiple crystalline nodes simultaneously." Kyra's voice carried frustration and something that might have been desperation. "It would take dozens of Zephyrian specialists working in perfect harmony with precision timing that. That your people can't achieve alone," Sarah finished. "But human technology could provide the coordination framework." "I did not say that." "You didn't have to." Sarah was already pulling up tactical displays and resource allocation charts. "How many resonance specialists can you mobilize?" "Perhaps 40, though they would resist working within human technological frameworks. And how many crystalline nodes need simultaneous attention? Kyra consulted her own displays, her expression growing increasingly grim. 67 primary nodes across a network spanning 300 kilometers. Sarah felt her heart sink. Even with perfect coordination, they were looking at an impossible logistical challenge. Can some of the nodes be handled remotely? Zephyrine resonance requires physical presence and direct neural interface with crystalline structures. Remote operation is. Kyra paused, her silver eyes studying Sarah's face with sudden intensity. Why are you attempting to solve this problem? Because it needs solving. This crisis threatens primarily Zephyrine interests. Human facilities can be evacuated and rebuilt elsewhere. Your logical response would be to protect your own people and abandon ours to face the consequences of the geological instability. Sarah stared at her. You think I'd just write off an entire civilization because it's convenient? I think humans prioritize human survival above all other considerations. As any rational species would. Then you don't understand humans very well. Sarah turned back to the displays, her mind racing through possibilities. What if we combined human precision technology with Zephyrine resonance techniques? Networked communication to coordinate timing, portable amplification to extend specialist range, real-time monitoring to adjust for fluctuations. Kyra was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if she'd somehow offended her. When the Zephyrine finally spoke, her voice carried an odd quality, surprise mixed with something that might have been hope. That might be possible. But it would require unprecedented cooperation between our species. Zephyrine specialists would need to trust human equipment with their lives, and human technicians would need to interface with systems they don't understand. Can you convince your people to try? Can you convince yours? They looked at each other across the command station, and Sarah felt something shift between them. For the first time since they'd met, Kyra's hostility seemed to have been replaced by genuine partnership. I can convince mine, Sarah said. The question is whether you trust me enough to let me try. Kyra's crystalline features reflected the emergency lighting in patterns that emphasized her alien beauty and the stress she was clearly feeling. Trust is irrelevant. Logic demands utilizing all available resources during crisis situations. That's not what I asked. It is the only answer I can provide. The coordination effort that followed was the most complex operation Sarah had ever overseen. Human technical teams worked alongside Zephyrine specialists, combining technologies that had never been designed to interface. Communication protocols had to be established on the fly, cultural differences navigated in real time, and trust built between people who had been viewing each other as obstacles just days before. Through it all, Kyra worked beside Sarah with increasing confidence, their coordination becoming so seamless that other responders began treating them as a single command authority. But with each successful collaboration, Sarah noticed that Kyra's verbal hostility was returning with greater intensity. Your equipment calibrations are completely wrong, Kyra announced after they'd successfully coordinated the 15th node stabilization. Any competent technician would have adjusted for crystalline harmonic resonance variations. Which we did, Sarah pointed out. Using the exact specifications you provided. I merely corrected your obvious errors before they could cause failures. Chief Engineer Kane looked up from his station with obvious confusion. Kyra, you and Commander Mitchell have been working in perfect coordination for the past 4 hours. Why do you keep claiming she's incompetent? Kyra's crystalline skin flushed with deeper colors. Perfect coordination is impossible between species with fundamentally different approaches to problem solving. Then what would you call what we're witnessing? Adequate damage control of human insufficiency. Sarah was beginning to recognize the pattern. The more successfully they worked together, the more aggressively Kyra insisted on her incompetence. It was as if their compatibility was threatening something fundamental about the Zephyrion's worldview. The breakthrough came during the 5th hour, when a massive aftershock threatened to undo all their stabilization efforts. Sarah and Kyra coordinated the emergency response with an efficiency that bordered on telepathic, anticipating each other's commands, compensating for each other's limitations, creating solutions that neither could have developed alone. Critical node 17 is destabilizing, called the lead technician. Rerouting resonance flow through nodes 12 and 19, Kyra responded immediately. Adjusting amplification matrices to compensate, Sarah added before Kyra had finished speaking. Harmonic resonance achieving stability, reported the specialist at node 17. Crisis resolved. The command center erupted in cheers, but Sarah noticed that Kyra had gone very still beside her. When she looked over, she found the Zephyrian staring at her with an expression of profound conflict. Kyra? What's wrong? Nothing is wrong, Kyra said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. We should verify the stabilization readings before declaring success. But as they reviewed the data confirming their success, Sarah caught Kyra watching her with something that looked almost like fear. Not fear of her, but fear of something about their interaction that she couldn't quite identify. Kyra, she said quietly, are you all right? I am perfectly functional, Kyra replied, but she stepped away from the command station, putting distance between them for the first time all day. Though I should point out that this success was achieved despite significant human limitations, not because of any genuine competence. Sarah stared after her as Kyra moved to review reports that didn't require her attention, her body language radiating tension that had nothing to do with the seismic crisis they'd just resolved. The earthquake might be over, Sarah realized, but whatever was happening between her and Kyra Veltar was just beginning. The aftershocks continued through the evening, forcing Sarah and Kyra to remain at the Emergency Coordination Center for round-the-clock monitoring. As the night deepened and most of the other responders rotated out for rest, they found themselves alone with the soft hum of monitoring equipment and the occasional tremor that rattled the reinforced windows. The geological readings are stabilizing, Sarah observed, reviewing the latest seismic data. I think we actually pulled it off. We pulled nothing off, Kyra replied automatically, but her heart didn't seem to be in the denial. She sat in the chair beside Sarah's, her crystalline skin reflecting the dim emergency lighting in tired patterns. Adequate crisis management was achieved despite numerous complications. Complications like working with incompetent humans. Complications like... Kyra paused, her silver eyes studying Sarah's face in the low light. Like discovering that my expectations may have been incomplete. Sarah felt something shift in the space between them. Incomplete how? I was prepared for human arrogance, technological dependence, cultural insensitivity. Kyra's voice was quieter than Sarah had ever heard it, almost vulnerable. I was not prepared for tactical competence, genuine collaboration, or what? Kyra was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if she'd pushed too far. When the Zephyrian finally spoke, her words came slowly, as if each one required careful consideration. Or the possibility that working with a human could feel natural. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. And that's a problem because it contradicts everything I was taught about human-Zephyrian interaction. Because it suggests that my people's assumptions about your species may be flawed. Because... Kyra's hands clenched into fists on the table between them. Because finding compatibility with an alien species is considered a fundamental weakness among my people. Weakness how? Zephyrians pride themselves on self-sufficiency and species superiority. Needing assistance from others, especially from species we consider inferior, indicates personal inadequacy. Kyra's crystalline features reflected conflict in shifting patterns of light. A diplomat who develops appreciation for alien capabilities is seen as compromised, potentially traitorous. Sarah began to understand the impossible position Kyra had been placed in. So the more successfully we work together, the more dangerous it becomes for your career. For my entire standing within Zephyrian society. Which is why I have been attempting to maintain appropriate hostility despite evidence that such hostility may be counterproductive. By insulting me every time we succeed at something. By ensuring that observers understand my cooperation is reluctant necessity rather than willing partnership. Kyra's voice grew even quieter. Though I fear the distinction is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Another tremor shook the building, gentler than the earlier quakes but enough to rattle the windows. Instinctively, both women reached out to steady themselves, and their hands met on the table between them. For a moment, they both froze, staring at their joined hands, Sarah's pale human skin contrasting with Kyra's luminescent crystalline surface. "This is exactly what I mean," Kyra whispered, but she didn't pull her hand away. Automatic coordination, instinctive trust, unconscious compatibility. It should not be this easy. "Maybe that's because it's not about species," Sarah said softly. "Maybe it's just about us. There is no us. There can be no us." But Kyra's fingers tightened around Sarah's as she spoke. "I am a Zephyrian diplomat with responsibilities to my people. You are a human representative with your own obligations. Personal feelings are irrelevant to our professional duties." "Are they? Because it seems like our personal compatibility is what made our professional success possible." Kyra's silver eyes met hers in the dim light, and Sarah saw years of training warring with present reality. Personal compatibility is a liability in diplomatic relations. It clouds judgment, creates emotional dependencies, compromises objectivity. Or it builds trust, enables communication, and creates solutions that pure objectivity never could. You do not understand Zephyrian culture. Emotional attachment to other species is seen as a form of mental illness, a failure of proper conditioning. Kyra's voice carried pain that she was trying to hide. "If my people suspected that I had developed feelings for a human, my career would be over." "What about what you want, regardless of what your people think?" The question seemed to cause Kyra physical discomfort. "What I want is irrelevant. I have duties, obligations, responsibilities that transcend personal preferences. Even if those personal preferences might make you better at fulfilling those duties." Kyra stared at their joined hands as if they represented an impossible puzzle. "How can betraying fundamental Zephyrian principles make me a better Zephyrian representative?" "By proving that those principles might be wrong." The building shook again, and the lights flickered. In the brief moment of darkness, Sarah felt Kyra's grip on her hand tighten convulsively, as if she were afraid of losing something precious. When the emergency lighting stabilized, they found themselves sitting closer together, though neither could remember moving. "This is impossible," Kyra whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of monitoring equipment. "I have spent days attempting to maintain professional hostility while fighting the urge to." "To what?" "To trust you completely. To rely on your judgment. To feel safer when you are nearby than when you are not." Kyra's crystalline features reflected the emergency lighting in patterns that emphasized her vulnerability. "These are not appropriate feelings for a Zephyrian diplomat to have about a human counterpart." Sarah squeezed Kyra's hand gently. "What if appropriate feelings and honest feelings aren't the same thing? Then I am compromised beyond redemption." Kyra's laugh was bitter. "Do you know what the worst part is? Tell me." "The worst part is that I no longer care if I am compromised. 3 days ago, maintaining proper Zephyrian dignity was the most important thing in my existence. Now." She looked directly into Sarah's eyes. "Now I find myself more concerned with your safety than with my reputation." Sarah felt her heart racing. "Kyra. I know this is inappropriate. I know it violates every principle of professional diplomatic conduct. I know my people would consider me a traitor to everything they value." Kyra's voice grew stronger, as if admitting the truth was giving her courage. "But when that ceiling collapsed during our first meeting, my only thought was protecting you. When we worked together during the crisis, I felt more competent and confident than I have in years. And now, sitting here in the dark with your hand in mine, I cannot bring myself to care what anyone else thinks is appropriate. So don't. It is not that simple. I have responsibilities." "You have a choice," Sarah interrupted gently. You can choose duty over truth, or you can choose to trust that maybe the truth serves a higher duty than blind obedience to cultural prejudices. Kyra was quiet for a long moment, her luminescent patterns shifting through what Sarah was learning to recognize as deep internal conflict. You make it sound easy. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's worth it. How can you be certain? Because in 3 days, you've challenged every assumption I had about Zephyrians, shown me perspectives I never would have considered, and made me a better leader than I could have been alone. Sarah turned in her chair to face Kyra fully. If that's what happens when we stop fighting each other, imagine what we could accomplish if we actually work together. And if my people reject me for choosing cooperation over superiority? Then maybe your people need to learn the same lesson we're learning. Kyra studied Sarah's face in the dim light, and Sarah could practically see the moment when years of conditioning finally gave way to present reality. Sarah, Kyra said, and it was the first time she had used Sarah's given name instead of her rank. I believe I may have misjudged humans rather significantly. Just humans in general, or me specifically? Both. Though you specifically have proven to be particularly challenging to my preconceptions. Kyra's smile was tentative but genuine. You are not weak, despite your physical limitations. You are not arrogant, despite your technological confidence. And you are not inferior, despite what I was taught to believe. High praise from someone who spent 3 days insulting my competence. About that. Kyra's crystalline skin flushed with what Sarah was learning to recognize as embarrassment. I may have been somewhat overcompensating in my attempts to maintain professional distance. Somewhat. Perhaps significantly overcompensating. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, hands still joined, watching the seismic monitors register the planet's gradual return to stability. Finally, Sarah spoke. Kyra, what happens now? When the crisis is over and we have to return to normal diplomatic relations? I do not know, Kyra admitted. I have never been in a situation where my personal feelings conflicted so completely with my professional obligations. Maybe that's because your professional obligations are based on false assumptions. Or maybe my personal feelings are compromising my judgment in ways that will prove catastrophic for both our peoples. Sarah squeezed Kyra's hand again. There's only one way to find out. By abandoning centuries of Zephyrian diplomatic tradition based on 3 days of crisis cooperation. By trusting that maybe centuries of tradition weren't serving anyone's best interests. Kyra laughed, the sound carrying relief along with lingering uncertainty. You realize that what you are suggesting could destroy my career, my social standing, and my relationship with my own people? I realize that continuing to pretend you hate me when you clearly don't is slowly destroying something that could be incredible for both of us. In the soft light of the emergency systems, with the planet finally settling into stability around them, Kyra made her choice. She lifted their joined hands and studied them, human and Zephyrian, different but somehow perfectly complementary. Sarah Mitchell, she said formally, I believe I owe you an apology. For what? For 3 days of deliberately cruel insults designed to hide the fact that I respect your competence, value your judgment, and... Her voice grew softer. And care more about your well-being than is appropriate for a professional relationship. Sarah smiled. Apology accepted. Though I should point out that inappropriately caring about someone's well-being is usually called friendship. Or something more. Something more, Kyra repeated thoughtfully. Is that what this is? I don't know. But I'd like to find out. As dawn began to break over the settled landscape outside, they sat together in the quiet coordination center, hands joined and guards finally lowered, ready to discover what lay beyond the hatred that had never been hatred at all. The morning after brought clear skies, stable seismic readings, and the inevitable return to normal diplomatic protocols. Sarah arrived at the coordination center to find Kyra already there, but the ease they discovered in the darkness had been replaced by the Zephyrian's familiar rigid posture and neutral expression. Commander Mitchell, Kyra said formally as Sarah approached. I trust you rested adequately despite the irregular circumstances. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. After everything they'd shared the night before, they were back to titles and professional distance. I slept fine, thank you. How are the geological readings this morning? Stable within acceptable parameters. The crystalline matrix appears to have achieved permanent stabilization. Kyra's voice carried no warmth, no acknowledgement of their previous intimacy. Normal operations can resume immediately. Good. Sarah moved to the monitoring station, trying to hide her disappointment. I suppose we should begin transitioning back to standard diplomatic procedures. Indeed. The emergency protocols are no longer necessary. They worked in silence for several minutes, their interaction polite but distant. Other staff members began arriving for the morning shift, and Sarah watched Kyra's posture become even more rigid as witnesses appeared. Commander Mitchell, announced Chief Engineer Kane as he reviewed overnight reports, I wanted to thank you and Kyra for the coordination yesterday. Best interspecies cooperation I've ever witnessed. We simply performed our assigned duties, Kyra replied stiffly. Emergency protocols require temporary coordination between human and Zephyrian resources. Kane looked confused. Temporary? But the integration project will proceed according to originally established parameters, Kyra interrupted. The crisis cooperation was a necessary deviation, not a permanent modification of diplomatic procedures. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized what was happening. In the light of day, with other people watching, Kyra was retreating back into the safety of protocol and prejudice. Of course, Sarah said quietly. Temporary deviation. The day progressed with painful politeness. Kyra reverted to her previous hostility, but now Sarah could see the effort it required. The Zephyrians' insults lacked their original conviction, and her protective positioning continued despite her hostile words. Your resource allocation proposals show typical human short-sightedness, Kyra announced during the afternoon coordination meeting, but Sarah noticed that she'd actually implemented several of those same proposals in her own reports. I'll take that into consideration, Sarah replied, playing along with the charade. The breaking point came near the end of the day, when Sarah received notification of a transfer request that had been approved by both governments. The integration project would continue, but with new human representation. Sarah would be reassigned to a less sensitive diplomatic position within the week. She found Kyra in the observation deck overlooking the colony, staring out at the landscape they'd worked together to save. So you're leaving, Kyra said without turning around. The transfer was requested this morning. Apparently, someone reported that the current human representative had become too familiar with her Zephyrian counterpart. Kyra's shoulders tensed. Appropriate professional distance is essential for effective diplomatic relations. Is it? Because yesterday we saved an entire civilization by abandoning professional distance. Yesterday was an emergency situation. Normal protocols were suspended out of necessity. Sarah moved to stand beside Kyra at the observation window. And today? Today we return to appropriate diplomatic procedures. Even if those procedures prevent us from being as effective as we could be together. Kyra was quiet for a long moment, her crystalline features reflecting the afternoon light in patterns that Sarah had learned to read as internal conflict. Sarah, she said finally, and the use of her given name was like a crack in the professional facade. You do not understand the position you have put me in. Then explain it to me. My people monitored our interactions during the crisis. They observed the coordination between us. Questions have been raised about my ability to maintain proper Zephyrian objectivity. Sarah felt anger building in her chest. So they're punishing you for being good at your job. They are concerned that my judgment has been compromised by inappropriate emotional attachment to a human representative. Kyra's voice grew quiet. They are not wrong. Inappropriate according to whom? According to every principle of Zephyrian diplomatic training. According to centuries of cultural precedent. According to According to rules made by people who never experienced what we experienced. Kyra turned to face her, and Sarah saw tears in the Zephyrian's silver eyes. It does not matter what I experienced. It matters what is expected of me. And what's expected is that you hate me. What's expected is that I maintain proper species dignity and avoid emotional compromise that could affect my professional judgment. Sarah stared at her. So you're choosing duty over truth. I am choosing survival over. Kyra's voice broke slightly. Over feelings that cannot be allowed to exist. Cannot be allowed by whom? By anyone who matters in my world. Sarah felt something break inside her chest. And I don't matter. Kyra's composure finally cracked completely. You matter more than anything else in my existence, which is exactly why this is impossible. The admission hung between them like a physical presence. Kyra immediately looked stricken, as if she'd revealed a dangerous secret. Sarah, She began, then stopped, her hands clenching into fists. This is exactly what I cannot allow to happen. Why not? Because the moment I admit that Kyra took a shaking breath. The moment I admit that I care more about your well-being than about my own reputation, I become a traitor to everything my people believe about proper conduct. And if your people are wrong, then I will have destroyed my entire life for nothing. Sarah moved closer, studying Kyra's face. What if you've been destroying your entire life by denying this? Sarah, please. Do not make this harder than it already is. I'm not trying to make it hard. I'm trying to make it honest. Sarah reached out tentatively, and when Kyra didn't pull away, she took the Zephyrian's hands in her own. Kyra, yesterday night, when you admitted how you felt, that was the most real I've ever seen you. Everything else. The hostility, the insults, the professional distance, that's the performance. The performance is what keeps me safe. Safe from what? From being happy. From being genuine. From admitting that maybe your people's prejudices are wrong. Kyra stared down at their joined hands, her crystalline skin reflecting the light in patterns of profound conflict. From losing everything that makes me who I am. Or maybe from discovering who you really are beneath all the conditioning. For a long moment, they stood in silence. Then Kyra looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes with an expression of desperate resolve. Sarah, if I ask you not to transfer, if I tell my people that our cooperation is essential for the integration project's success, if I choose. She took a shaking breath. If I choose you over their approval, will you stay? Sarah felt her heart leap. Are you asking me to stay? I am asking if you would be willing to build something with someone whose people will probably consider her a disgrace. Kyra, I would be honored to build something with the bravest person I've ever met. Brave? Kyra laughed, but it was a sound of relief rather than bitterness. I have spent days insulting you to hide the fact that I was falling in love with you. That hardly seems brave. No, Sarah said softly, but choosing love over fear, even when it costs you everything else. That's the definition of brave. Kyra's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face. Then perhaps it is time to stop being afraid. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same observation deck, watching Kyra address a mixed assembly of human colonists and Zephyrian natives. The integration project had become a model for interspecies cooperation, largely due to the diplomatic innovations developed by its human and Zephyrian co-directors. The success of our cooperation, Kyra was saying, demonstrates that the strength of any civilization lies not in the purity of its traditions, but in its willingness to grow beyond the limitations of its assumptions. In the audience, several Zephyrian officials who had initially opposed Kyra's methods now nodded in approval. Results, it turned out, had a way of changing minds about proper procedures. Any questions? Kyra asked as she concluded her presentation. An elderly Zephyrian in the back row raised his hand. Director Veltar, there are those who say your methods represent a dangerous departure from traditional Zephyrian diplomatic principles. How do you respond to such concerns? Kyra's smile was confident and genuine. I respond that traditional principles which prevent us from achieving optimal outcomes for our people deserve to be questioned. And I would point out that the most dangerous departure from principle would be allowing prejudice to prevent us from building the future our children deserve. After the assembly dispersed, Sarah joined Kyra on the observation deck where their relationship had finally become honest. "No regrets?" Sarah asked, taking Kyra's hand in a gesture that had become natural between them. "Only that it took me so long to admit what I felt from the beginning." Kyra's crystalline features caught the afternoon light, but now the patterns reflected contentment rather than conflict. "Though I suppose some truths require time to become safe to speak. And some people require time to become brave enough to hear them." They stood together watching the sun set over a world where two species had learned that cooperation was stronger than competition, and that the best partnerships were built not on similarity but on the courage to let differences become complementary strengths. "Kyra," Sarah said as the first stars began to appear, "what do you think would have happened if we'd been honest with each other from the beginning?" Kyra considered the question seriously. "I think we would have been terrified of our feelings and tried even harder to fight them. Some truths can only be accepted after we've exhausted all our reasons for rejecting them. So 3 days of you hating me was necessary for us to get here. 3 days of me pretending to hate you while falling hopelessly in love with you," Kyra corrected with a laugh. "Though I should point out that my hand never let go of yours, even when my words were trying to push you away." Sarah squeezed Kyra's hand, marveling at how something that had once seemed impossible now felt as natural as breathing. "Sometimes the body knows truth before the mind is ready to accept it." "And sometimes," Kyra said, lifting their joined hands to catch the starlight, "the heart holds on to what it needs most, even when we're too afraid to admit we need it." In the growing darkness, surrounded by the lights of a thriving colony built on the foundation of their partnership, they stood together, no longer fighting the truth that had been obvious from the moment Kyra's hand had first reached out to protect the human she claimed to despise. Some connections, they had learned, were stronger than fear, deeper than prejudice, and more persistent than pride. And some kinds of love were patient enough to wait for courage to catch up with truth.